A pregnant, abandoned wife inherited a $100 billion real estate empire days after her husband kicked her out to marry his mistress. But what she did shocked them in ways nobody could have predicted. Victoria Hayes stood on the rain-soaked steps of the mansion she'd called home for 6 years, her hands trembling as they cradled her swollen belly. But her husband, Daniel Hayes, the man who'd promised her forever, had just thrown her suitcase onto the wet pavement and declared his love for another woman. The inheritance letter tucked inside her coat pocket, still sealed, still unread, had arrived that very morning from an attorney representing a grandmother she'd never known existed. But Victoria hadn't opened it because she'd been too devastated by the eviction notice Daniel's lawyer had served alongside his mistress's smug smile. Within 72 hours, this broken woman would transform from a homeless, penniless reject into the owner of the largest real estate portfolio on the eastern seaboard. But the revenge she would orchestrate wouldn't involve lawsuits or public humiliation. The mistress who'd stolen her husband believed she'd won the ultimate prize, but she had no idea that the poor, pathetic wife she'd mocked was about to become her landlord, her boss, and the architect of a downfall so perfectly orchestrated it would make headlines from New York to Los Angeles. Daniel Hayes thought he'd traded up when he chose a younger, child-free woman over his pregnant wife. But would he still feel victorious when he discovered that every building his new fiancée lived in, every office his company operated from, and every investment property he'd ever envied now belonged to the woman he'd abandoned? Victoria's grandmother had built an empire in secret, waiting for the perfect heir to emerge. But why had she chosen a granddaughter she'd never met? And what clause in the inheritance would force Victoria to make an impossible choice between justice and mercy? The abandoned wife held ultimate power over the two people who destroyed her life. But would she use that power to crush them completely? Or would her discovery of the real reason behind her husband's betrayal change everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of family? The story. The rain hammered against Victoria Hayes's face with the kind of violence that matched the destruction of her life. But she barely felt it because the physical cold was nothing compared to the ice that had formed around her heart in the past 3 hours. She'd woken that morning to breakfast in bed, Daniel's supposed apology for working late all week, but by noon she was standing on the street with one suitcase, her phone, and the clothes on her back while a moving truck removed every trace of her existence from their home. The pregnancy test she'd taken 8 weeks ago had promised to fix everything, but instead, it had accelerated the ending Daniel had apparently been planning for months. 6 years of marriage, 3 years of trying for a baby, and countless nights of reassuring him that she didn't care about his family's disapproval of her common background had culminated in this abandonment while carrying his child. Victoria's fingers found the letter in her coat pocket again, but she still couldn't bring herself to open it because processing one catastrophic life change at a time was all her mind could handle. The return address read Whitmore and Associates, Attorneys at Law, and the sender was listed as Estate of Marguerite Whitmore, but Victoria had no idea who Marguerite Whitmore was or why her estate would be contacting someone who'd grown up in foster care with no known family connections. Her phone buzzed with a text message, but Victoria's heart sank when she saw it was from Cassandra Reeves, the woman who'd been her husband's business associate for the past 8 months. The message contained a single photo, Cassandra and Daniel together in what appeared to be Victoria's former bedroom, but the bed had already been changed to white silk sheets, Cassandra's preference apparently, and Daniel's arm was wrapped around her waist with the casual ownership of someone who'd already moved in. The caption read, "Thanks for warming up the house for me. Don't worry, I'll take good care of your husband." Victoria's thumb hovered over the delete button, but something stopped her because she realized she needed to remember this moment, needed to document the exact depth of cruelty these two people were capable of inflicting. She took a screenshot, but then her stomach churned with a nausea that had nothing to do with morning sickness and everything to do with the realization that she'd been played for a fool. The lawyer's letter suddenly felt heavy in her pocket, but Victoria decided that standing in the rain processing betrayal was accomplishing nothing, so she grabbed her suitcase and headed toward the only place she could think of, the public library 3 blocks away, where she could at least get warm and dry while figuring out her next move. Inside the library's bathroom, Victoria changed into dry clothes and studied her reflection in the mirror, but the woman staring back looked like a stranger with hollow eyes and skin so pale it appeared translucent. At 28 years old, she was supposed to be entering the prime of her life, but instead she looked like someone who'd aged a decade overnight. Her hands shook as she finally opened the letter, but what she read made her legs give out, forcing her to sit on the closed toilet lid to process the impossible words printed on heavy cream cardstock. Dear Ms. Victoria Hayes, née Victoria Ann Whitmore, we represent the estate of your maternal grandmother, Marguerite Eleanor Whitmore, who passed away on October 15th. As her sole surviving heir, you are entitled to inherit her complete estate, valued at approximately $100 billion. This includes, but is not limited to, the Whitmore Real Estate Holdings, a portfolio of 847 commercial and residential properties across 17 states, as well as various investments, trusts, and subsidiary companies. We understand this news may come as a shock, but your grandmother had been searching for you since your mother's death in 1998. Unfortunately, the foster care system's privacy protocols prevented us from locating you until you turned 18 and your records became partially accessible. Your recent marriage license, filed under your birth name, finally allowed us to confirm your identity. Your grandmother left specific instructions that you were not to be contacted until her passing, but she has been monitoring your welfare from a distance for the past decade. She wanted you to build your own life before receiving this inheritance, believing that true character reveals itself through adversity. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to begin the inheritance process. Time-sensitive decisions regarding the estate require your immediate attention. Your grandmother's final message to you reads, "Forgive me for staying away, but never forget that Whitmore women are forged in fire. You've survived the flames. Now build your empire. Sincerely, Harrison Whitmore, Senior Partner, Whitmore and Associates." Victoria read the letter 3 times, but each reading only deepened her confusion because nothing in her life had prepared her for this revelation. Her mother had died when Victoria was 7, but she'd been told it was a car accident and that she had no other family, no safety net, no one to turn to when social services came to take her away. The name Whitmore sparked something in her memory, but it took several minutes of mental searching before she connected it to the legendary real estate developer whose buildings dominated skylines across the country. Marguerite Whitmore was a business icon, a woman who'd turned a single apartment building into an empire worth more than most countries' GDP. But the idea that this titan of industry was Victoria's grandmother seemed impossible. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it was a call from an unknown number with a Manhattan area code. Victoria hesitated, but then answered because she had nothing left to lose. "Ms. Hayes, this is Harrison Whitmore. I'm calling to confirm that you received our letter and to express my deepest condolences, both for the loss of your grandmother and for the domestic situation you're currently facing." Victoria's voice came out rough and suspicious. "How do you know about my domestic situation?" "Your grandmother employed a private security team to ensure your safety," Harrison explained, his tone professionally neutral but tinged with something that might have been sympathy. "They've been monitoring from a respectful distance for years, but when they observed your husband's attorney serving you with eviction papers this morning, they contacted me immediately. Marguerite left very specific instructions about protecting you during vulnerable moments. The revelation that she'd been watched for years should have felt invasive, but instead Victoria felt a strange comfort in knowing that someone had cared enough to ensure she was safe, even from a distance. "I don't understand any of this," Victoria admitted, her free hand moving protectively to her belly. "Why didn't she contact me? Why did she let me struggle through foster care, through college debt, through—" Her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. "Through everything." Harrison was quiet for a moment, but when he spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who'd known Marguerite Whitmore personally. "Your grandmother believed that hardship builds character, but she also knew that revealing herself too early would have made you a target. There are people who would have used you to get to her, people who would have destroyed you to hurt her empire. She protected you the only way she knew how, by staying away while ensuring you were never truly alone." Victoria wanted to be angry about this, but she was too emotionally exhausted to summon righteous indignation. So instead, she asked the practical question that would determine her immediate future. "What happens now?" "Now you come to Manhattan," Harrison said firmly. "We have an apartment ready for you in one of your buildings, the Whitmore Tower penthouse actually, and tomorrow morning we'll begin the inheritance process. But first, we need to discuss something time-sensitive regarding one of your properties." Victoria almost laughed at the absurdity of "one of your properties," but she managed to keep her voice steady. "What property?" "The Meridian Towers on Park Avenue," Harrison replied, but there was something careful in his tone that made Victoria's instincts prickle. "It's a luxury residential complex with 50 units, but it also happens to be where your husband's company, Hayes Capital, leases their office space on the entire 10th floor. Additionally, the penthouse apartment that your husband's companion, Ms. Cassandra Reeves, resides in, also your property." The revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow, but this time it was accompanied by something she hadn't felt in hours, a spark of power. "You're telling me I'm their landlord?" "As of 4 days ago, when your grandmother passed and the estate transferred to your name, yes," Harrison confirmed. "Both leases are up for renewal in 60 days, but more importantly, there's a clause in the Meridian Towers commercial lease that allows the property owner to terminate with 30 days' notice if the tenant is found to have engaged in fraudulent business practices." Victoria's mind raced ahead, but she forced herself to slow down and think strategically rather than emotionally. "And has Hayes Capital engaged in fraudulent business practices?" "Your grandmother's investigative team has been monitoring Daniel Hayes since he began courting you 6 years ago," Harrison said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "They've documented extensive evidence of securities fraud, tax evasion, and insider trading. Marguerite never interfered because she wanted to see if he truly loved you or if he was using you as a cover for his activities. Unfortunately, his recent behavior has answered that question definitively." The pieces were falling into place, but Victoria still struggled to comprehend the scope of what she was hearing. "She knew he was a criminal and let me marry him anyway. She knew he was ambitious and morally flexible, but the criminal behavior escalated after your marriage," Harrison corrected gently. "Your grandmother believed that people reveal their true nature when given enough rope, and she wanted you to see who he really was before she gave you the power to do something about it. She also believed that protecting you from every bad decision would prevent you from developing the judgment necessary to run her empire." Victoria closed her eyes and leaned against the cold bathroom tile, but her mind was already shifting from victim to strategist because survival had always required her to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. "What would you recommend I do about the leases?" "That's entirely your decision," Harrison said, but there was approval in his tone that suggested he already knew which path she'd choose. "However, I should mention that Hayes Capital owes approximately $2.3 million in back rent due to accounting errors that have been overlooked by the previous property management company, a company that coincidentally received kickbacks from Mr. Hayes for their leniency. The bathroom door opened and a librarian poked her head in, but Victoria waved her away and mouthed an apology because this conversation was too important to interrupt. "How soon can I get to Manhattan?" "There's a car waiting outside the library," Harrison replied smoothly. "Your grandmother's security team has been shadowing you since you left your former residence, but they'll make themselves known now that you're aware of their presence. They'll ensure you arrive safely, and I'll meet you at the penthouse this evening to begin reviewing your inheritance in detail." Victoria ended the call and stared at her reflection again, but this time she saw something different. Not a broken, abandoned woman, but someone who'd been forged in fire and was about to rise from the ashes with the power to reshape her entire world. The ride to Manhattan took 3 hours, but Victoria spent every minute of it reading through documents that Harrison had sent to her phone, property portfolios, financial statements, and detailed reports on Daniel Hayes's criminal activities that made her realize just how thoroughly she'd been deceived. The man she'd married presented himself as a moderately successful investment banker, but in reality, he was running a Ponzi scheme that had defrauded dozens of elderly investors out of their retirement savings. Cassandra Reeves featured prominently in the reports, but not just as Daniel's mistress. She was his partner in crime, the one who recruited wealthy victims through her social connections and convinced them to invest in Daniel's fake hedge fund. Their affair had started as a business arrangement, but somewhere along the way it had evolved into something personal, though the reports suggested that even their relationship was transactional rather than romantic. The Whitmore Tower penthouse took Victoria's breath away, but not because of its obvious luxury. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, the marble floors, or the art collection that probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. What struck her was the feeling that she'd finally arrived somewhere she belonged, that the years of foster homes and cramped apartments and making do with less had been preparation for this moment. Harrison Whitmore turned out to be a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of face that had seen everything but still managed to find humanity in the world. He greeted Victoria with a warm handshake and a genuine smile, but then he got straight to business because time was apparently of the essence. "Your grandmother's will includes several unusual clauses," Harrison explained as they sat in the penthouse library with contracts spread across the massive oak desk. "The first is that you must take active control of the empire within 30 days, meaning you can't simply hire managers and disappear. She believed that leadership requires presence, requires making difficult decisions personally rather than delegating them to others." Victoria nodded, but her hands moved protectively to her belly again because she was acutely aware that she was making decisions not just for herself, but for her unborn child. "What other clauses?" "The second is more philosophical," Harrison said carefully. "Marguerite believed that true character reveals itself through how we treat those who've wronged us when we have the power to destroy them. She's left you complete control over the Meridian Towers property, but she's also included a challenge. You must decide within 30 days whether to pursue full legal action against Daniel Hayes and Cassandra Reeves, or whether to offer them a chance at redemption." The idea of offering redemption to the two people who destroyed her life made Victoria's blood boil, but she forced herself to listen rather than react emotionally. "If you choose prosecution, your grandmother's legal team will ensure they face the full consequences of their actions, likely 20 to 30 years in federal prison," Harrison continued. "But if you choose redemption, you'll offer them an alternative. They work off their debt to society by managing a Whitmore property in one of the economically depressed areas your grandmother identified for revitalization, using their business skills to rebuild communities rather than defraud investors. Victoria laughed, but it was a bitter sound that held no humor. You're asking me to reward them for destroying my life? No, Harrison said firmly, leaning forward with an intensity that commanded attention. I'm telling you that your grandmother believed the measure of a person's strength isn't how they crush their enemies, but how they transform their enemies into something better. She built her empire by taking broken people and broken places and making them whole again, and she wants to know if you have the same capacity for transformation. The challenge hung in the air, but Victoria wasn't ready to answer it yet because she needed time to process everything that had happened in the past 12 hours. Can I have a few days to decide? You have 30 days, Harrison confirmed, but there are immediate decisions that need to be made regarding the Meridian Towers leases and the back rent owed by Hayes Capital. Those decisions will determine whether Mr. Hayes and Ms. Reeves even have the resources to survive long enough for you to decide their ultimate fate. Victoria stood and walked to the windows, but her eyes didn't see the glittering Manhattan skyline because her mind was traveling back through 6 years of marriage, searching for signs she'd missed, moments when she should have known something was wrong. The late nights Daniel claimed were work meetings, but now she understood were criminal conspiracies. The expensive gifts he'd given Cassandra, but now she realized were purchased with stolen money. The way he'd discouraged Victoria from pursuing her career in architecture, but now she saw was because he needed her dependent and controllable. The baby moved inside her, but the flutter of life against her ribs reminded Victoria that this wasn't just about revenge or justice. It was about building a future for the child who would inherit this empire one day. What example did she want to set? What values did she want to pass down? Was her grandmother right that true strength came from transformation rather than destruction? Tell me about the revitalization properties, Victoria said suddenly, turning back to Harrison with a decision forming in her mind. What communities did my grandmother identify? Harrison's eyes lit up with approval, but he maintained his professional demeanor as he pulled up files on his tablet. There are 7 properties in different cities: Detroit, Cleveland, Baltimore, Memphis, and 3 others, all in neighborhoods that have been devastated by economic decline, crime, and abandonment. Your grandmother purchased these properties over the past decade, but she waited to begin redevelopment because she wanted her heir to oversee the projects personally. Victoria studied the photos and reports, but what struck her was the humanity in her grandmother's vision, because these weren't just investment properties. They were communities that needed hope, families that needed opportunity, children who needed to see that transformation was possible. An idea began to form in her mind, but it was audacious enough that she hesitated before speaking it aloud. What if we gave Daniel and Cassandra a choice? They can either face prosecution and lose everything, or they can move to one of these communities and spend the next 5 years managing the redevelopment project. They'd live in modest housing, earn a modest salary, and every dollar they generate beyond covering costs goes to compensating their fraud victims. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, but then he smiled in a way that suggested Victoria had just passed some kind of test. That's exactly the kind of solution your grandmother would have proposed. But you realize they'll probably choose prison over what they'll perceive as poverty and humiliation. Then they'll go to prison, Victoria said simply. But they deserve the chance to prove they're capable of something better than fraud and betrayal. If they choose redemption, then maybe there's hope for them. If they choose to maintain their pride and face prosecution, then they've chosen their own fate. The next morning, Victoria wore one of the designer suits she found in the penthouse closet. Her grandmother had apparently anticipated her size perfectly and walked into the Whitmore and Associates conference room with Harrison at her side, but every eye in the room belonged to someone whose life she now controlled. Daniel Hayes sat at the far end of the conference table in his expensive suit, but his face had gone pale when he'd been summoned to this meeting and seen Victoria walking in as the owner rather than the victim. Cassandra Reeves was beside him, but her usual confidence had evaporated when she realized that the woman she'd mocked was now her landlord, her judge, and the person who controlled her future. "Good morning," Victoria said calmly, taking her seat at the head of the table with a composure she didn't entirely feel, but had learned to project during years of survival. "I'm sure you're both confused about why you're here, so let me clarify. I'm Victoria Whitmore, sole heir to the Whitmore real estate empire, and as of 4 days ago, I own this building, your apartment, Daniel's office space, and approximately 846 other properties worth $100 billion. Daniel's face cycled through shock, disbelief, and then something that might have been calculation, because even in this moment, he was looking for an angle to exploit. "This is some kind of joke. Victoria grew up in foster care. She doesn't have family money. My grandmother kept her distance for my own protection," Victoria explained, her voice steady despite the urge to scream at him about the betrayal, about the pregnancy he'd dismissed, about the 6 years she'd wasted on someone incapable of real love. "But she kept detailed records of your activities, Daniel. Your Ponzi scheme, your tax evasion, your securities fraud, all documented with enough evidence to guarantee lengthy prison sentences for both of you." Cassandra leaned forward, but her usual seductive confidence had been replaced by naked fear. "You can't prove any of that." Harrison slid folders across the table, but the contents spoke for themselves. Bank records, recorded phone calls, email correspondence, testimony from witnesses who'd agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity. "Actually, we can prove all of it," he said mildly. "The question isn't whether you're guilty, that's already established, but what Ms. Whitmore chooses to do about it." Victoria watched them process this information, but she felt none of the satisfaction she'd expected from seeing them squirm, because revenge was turning out to be a hollow emotion that didn't heal the wounds they'd inflicted. "You both have a choice to make," she said, pulling out the photographs of the Detroit property that needed redevelopment. "Option 1, I turn all this evidence over to the FBI, you're both arrested within hours, and you spend the next 20 to 30 years in federal prison while your victims lose everything." Daniel opened his mouth to argue, but Victoria raised her hand to silence him because she wasn't finished. "Option 2, you move to Detroit and manage the redevelopment of this property for the next 5 years. You'll live in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on site, earn a combined salary of $60,000 per year, and every dollar generated by the property beyond operational costs goes to a victim restitution fund. At the end of 5 years, if you've successfully revitalized the community and repaid your victims, your criminal records will be sealed and you'll be free to rebuild your lives." The conference room was silent, but Victoria could see the wheels turning in Daniel's head as he tried to find the trap, the loophole, the way to manipulate this situation to his advantage. Cassandra looked like she wanted to be sick, but whether from fear or disgust at the prospect of living in Detroit was unclear. "This is insane," Daniel finally said, his voice rising with indignation. "You can't force us to become some kind of poverty wage property managers. That's not justice. That's revenge disguised as redemption." "No, prison is justice," Victoria corrected coldly. "This is mercy, though I'm not sure either of you deserve it. But my grandmother believed that people are capable of change if given the right motivation, and I'm honoring her legacy by offering you this choice. You have 72 hours to decide." Cassandra found her voice, but it came out small and uncertain in a way Victoria had never heard before. "What about us? Our relationship? Are we supposed to just work together in some terrible neighborhood and pretend everything's fine?" Victoria's expression hardened, but she maintained her composure because losing control now would undermine everything she was trying to accomplish. That's between the two of you to figure out. You wanted each other badly enough to destroy my life, so now you get to discover if that connection survives when you're not living in luxury built on stolen money and betrayal. Maybe you'll realize you were never really in love. You were just two people who enjoyed hurting others together. She stood to leave, but Daniel called out with a desperation that was new and unsettling. "Victoria, wait. I know I hurt you. I know what I did was unforgivable. But the baby, that's my child too. Don't I have rights?" The question stopped Victoria in her tracks, but when she turned back, her eyes were hard with a resolve that came from months of preparation she hadn't known she was doing. "You kicked me out while I was pregnant. You called this baby a complication you didn't need. You forfeited your parental rights the moment you chose your mistress and your crimes over your family. If you choose redemption, if you spend the next 5 years proving you're capable of caring about something other than yourself, then maybe I'll reconsider allowing you supervised visitation. But that decision is years away and entirely dependent on whether you become the kind of person worthy of knowing this child." Harrison escorted Victoria out of the conference room, but she could feel Daniel's and Cassandra's eyes boring into her back with a mixture of rage, fear, and something that might have been grudging respect, because she'd just demonstrated a power they'd never imagined she possessed. In the elevator, Victoria's composure finally cracked, but Harrison handed her a handkerchief without comment because he understood that strength didn't mean never breaking. It meant breaking in private and rebuilding yourself before anyone else saw the cracks. "Your grandmother would be proud," Harrison said quietly as they descended toward the lobby, "not because you're destroying them, but because you're giving them a chance to become something better while still ensuring they face consequences for their actions." Victoria dabbed at her eyes, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I need to know something. Did my grandmother ever forgive the people who wronged her?" Harrison was quiet for a moment, but then he shared a story that Victoria suspected was meant to guide her through the difficult days ahead. "Marguerite built her empire from nothing after her husband stole her first property development and left her bankrupt while pregnant with your mother. She could have destroyed him legally, but instead she waited 15 years, bought back that property for 10 times what he'd stolen it for, and then offered him a job as her janitor. He refused out of pride, died bitter and alone, while she built an empire. She always said her greatest regret wasn't giving him a chance to change. It was that he chose pride over redemption." The story settled something in Victoria's chest, but she understood the lesson her grandmother was teaching from beyond the grave. Offering redemption wasn't about being weak or letting people off easy. It was about giving them enough rope to either hang themselves or climb to something better, while ensuring you remained strong regardless of which choice they made. 3 days later, Daniel and Cassandra's answer came through their attorney, but the response was split in a way Victoria hadn't anticipated. Cassandra chose redemption, but Daniel chose prison because he couldn't stomach the idea of living in poverty under Victoria's control, even if it meant avoiding decades behind bars. "He thinks you'll crack and let him out early," Harrison explained when he delivered the news. "He's gambling that your compassion will become weakness and that he can manipulate you into forgiveness without actually earning it." Victoria absorbed this information, but she felt more sadness than anger, because Daniel was revealing exactly who he'd always been. Someone who would rather suffer than admit he was wrong. Someone who would choose pride over growth every single time. And Cassandra? "She signed the contract this morning," Harrison confirmed. "She'll move to Detroit next week and begin managing the property under the supervision of one of your grandmother's most trusted advisors. She claims she wants to prove that she's capable of more than what she became with Daniel, but time will tell if that's genuine or simply self-preservation." The months that followed tested Victoria in ways she couldn't have imagined, but she threw herself into learning her grandmother's business with an intensity that impressed even the most skeptical members of the Whitmore Real Estate Holdings Board. She attended every meeting, reviewed every contract, and visited every major property personally despite her advancing pregnancy, because she understood that earning respect required presence and commitment. The Detroit project became her obsession, but not because Cassandra was there, because it represented everything her grandmother had believed about the power of transformation. Victoria visited monthly, walking through neighborhoods that had been abandoned and forgotten, talking to residents who'd lost hope, meeting with community leaders who were desperate for investment, but skeptical that a wealthy developer would actually follow through. Cassandra's transformation was gradual, but Victoria watched it happen through monthly reports and quarterly site visits. The woman who'd once mocked poverty from her luxury penthouse was now living in a modest apartment, managing tenant relations, coordinating with local contractors, and attending community meetings where she had to face people who'd lost everything to economic decline. During Victoria's 6th-month visit, she and Cassandra stood in the construction site of what would become a community center, but the conversation that followed was nothing like what Victoria had expected. "I owe you an apology that words can't adequately express," Cassandra said, her designer clothes replaced by practical work attire covered in construction dust. "What I did to you was cruel and inexcusable, driven by jealousy and a complete lack of moral foundation. Being here, seeing what real struggle looks like, has made me realize how much damage I caused chasing superficial status." Victoria studied the other woman, but she saw genuine remorse rather than manipulation, because Cassandra's eyes had lost the calculating edge that had once defined her. "Do you miss your old life?" "Every single day," Cassandra admitted honestly, "but I also hate who I was in that life. I destroyed people, including myself, chasing things that never mattered. This work, this community, the people I'm helping, it's the first time I've ever done something that actually means something beyond my own gratification." The conversation didn't heal the wounds Cassandra had inflicted, but it suggested that redemption might actually be possible for people who genuinely wanted to change. Victoria left Detroit that day with a complicated mixture of emotions, but she understood that forgiveness was a process rather than a moment, something that would take years to fully develop if it ever came at all. Daniel's story took a darker turn, but Victoria refused to let his choices dictate her emotional state. He was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. But even from behind bars, he sent letters demanding to be part of his child's life, claiming that his imprisonment was Victoria's fault for not accepting his apology and letting him walk free. Victoria never responded to the letters, but she kept them in a file her child could read someday, when they were old enough to understand that some people choose destruction over redemption and that their choices don't define the people they hurt. Her daughter was born on a snowy December morning, but Victoria held the tiny, perfect baby and whispered promises about the empire they would build together, about the values they would uphold, about the legacy of transformation, rather than destruction that defined the Whitmore name. The Detroit project became a stunning success over the next 4 years, but Victoria credited Cassandra's management for much of that success because the other woman had proven capable of genuine change when given the right motivation and support. The neighborhood transformed from abandoned buildings and crime-ridden streets into a thriving community with affordable housing, local businesses, and opportunities for residents who'd been forgotten by every other developer. When Cassandra's 5-year term ended, Victoria offered her a choice: take the completion of her contract and walk away, or stay and continue managing the property as a paid employee with market rate compensation and the respect she'd earned through demonstrated commitment. Cassandra chose to stay, but she did it knowing that Victoria's trust had been earned rather than given, and that redemption was an ongoing process rather than a destination. The Whitmore real estate empire grew under Victoria's leadership, but she ran it according to her grandmother's principles, that buildings were about people rather than profit, that development should strengthen communities rather than displace them, that true wealth came from transformation rather than extraction. Years later, when her daughter was old enough to understand, Victoria took her to visit the Manhattan penthouse where everything had changed. But she also took her to Detroit to see what redemption looked like, to meet Cassandra and understand that people were capable of both terrible destruction and beautiful transformation. "Your great-grandmother built this empire from nothing," Victoria explained as they stood on the balcony overlooking Central Park. "But she taught me that real power isn't about crushing your enemies. It's about giving them the opportunity to become something better and building a life so magnificent that their approval becomes irrelevant." The girl looked up with eyes that held her mother's determination and her great-grandmother's fire. "What happened to Dad?" Victoria had been preparing for this question, but the answer was still complicated because Daniel had remained in prison, refusing every opportunity for early parole, because accepting those opportunities would have required admitting he was wrong, and his pride wouldn't allow that level of vulnerability. "He made choices," Victoria said carefully. "Not just the choice to betray us, but the choice to hold on to his anger and pride rather than becoming someone better. I gave him the same opportunity I gave Cassandra, the chance to transform his mistakes into meaning, but he chose to stay trapped in his own bitterness. That was his decision, not ours." The girl thought about this, but then she asked the question that mattered most. "Do you think people can really change?" Victoria smiled because the answer had become clear through years of watching Cassandra transform from the woman who'd destroyed her life into someone who dedicated herself to building communities and helping others. "I think people can change if they genuinely want to and if they're willing to do the hard work of becoming better. But I also think we can't force that change on them. We can only create the conditions where transformation becomes possible and then step back and let them choose." The Whitmore real estate empire continued to grow, but Victoria never forgot the lesson her grandmother had taught through absence and presence, through challenge and support, through the offer of redemption and the acceptance that not everyone would choose it. She built her legacy on the principle that true strength came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down, from offering second chances while maintaining boundaries, from transformation rather than destruction. And on quiet nights when her daughter was asleep and the city lights sparkled below, Victoria would stand at the window and whisper thanks to the grandmother she'd never met, but whose wisdom had given her not just an empire, but the tools to wield that power with grace, justice, and the kind of mercy that demanded accountability while still believing in the possibility of change. The pregnant, abandoned wife who'd been kicked out in the rain had become the architect of an empire. But more importantly, she'd become the kind of leader who understood that the truest measure of power wasn't how you destroyed your enemies. It was whether you gave them the opportunity to become something better, and whether you built a life so meaningful that their betrayal became nothing more than a footnote in a much larger story about resilience, redemption, and the transformative power of choosing grace over vengeance. 15 years had passed since that rain-soaked afternoon when Victoria Hayes had stood on the steps of her former home with nothing but a suitcase and an unopened letter. But the woman who now stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Whitmore Tower penthouse bore only a surface resemblance to that broken, abandoned wife. She was 43 now, but the years had refined her rather than diminished her, transforming her from someone who survived adversity into someone who wielded power with the kind of wisdom that could only come from having once possessed nothing. Her daughter, Eleanor Marguerite Whitmore, named for the grandmother who'd orchestrated this entire transformation from beyond the grave, sat at the massive oak desk reviewing property acquisition proposals. But at 15, she already possessed the sharp, analytical mind and compassionate heart that defined the Whitmore legacy. The girl had inherited Victoria's determination and Marguerite's strategic brilliance, but she'd also developed her own unique approach to leadership that combined technological innovation with traditional community-building principles. "Mom, we need to talk about the Chicago property," Eleanor said, looking up from her tablet with the serious expression she wore when discussing business matters. "The Tenants Association is requesting a meeting about rent increases, but their proposal actually makes financial sense if we're willing to accept lower short-term profits for long-term community stability." Victoria smiled because moments like these reminded her why she'd fought so hard to build something worth inheriting, but also because Eleanor instinctively understood the core principle that had defined Marguerite's empire, that buildings were about people first and profit second. "Show me the numbers." As they reviewed the proposal together, Victoria's mind drifted back through the 15 years that had transformed not just her life, but the lives of everyone connected to that fateful day when Daniel Hayes had kicked her out to marry his mistress. The story could have ended with simple revenge: Daniel in prison, Cassandra destroyed, Victoria triumphant. But life had proven far more complicated and far more interesting than any simple revenge fantasy. The intercom buzzed with Harrison Whitmore's voice, but after 15 years, he'd become more than just the attorney who'd delivered her inheritance. He'd become a trusted advisor, a father figure, and one of the few people Victoria could trust completely in a world where wealth attracted parasites and opportunists. "Victoria, your 2 p.m. appointment is here. Shall I send them up?" Victoria glanced at Eleanor, but the girl's eyes had already lit up with understanding because she knew exactly who was arriving and why this meeting mattered. "Send them up, Harrison, and thank you." The elevator doors opened 5 minutes later, but the woman who stepped into the penthouse was almost unrecognizable from the calculating, cruel mistress who'd stolen Victoria's husband 15 years ago. Cassandra Reeves was 44 now, but the luxury and vanity that had once defined her had been replaced by the practical elegance of someone who'd learned to find beauty in purpose rather than appearance. Her hair was streaked with natural gray that she didn't bother to dye. Her clothes were well made but functional rather than flashy, and her eyes held the kind of depth that came from years of genuine personal transformation. Behind Cassandra stood 2 teenagers who Victoria knew from quarterly reports and annual site visits, but seeing them in person always reinforced the magnitude of what the Detroit project had accomplished. Marcus was 17 now, a young black man who'd grown up in the neighborhood Cassandra managed, and who was heading to MIT in the fall on a full scholarship funded by the Whitmore Foundation. His sister, Jasmine, was 15, the same age as Eleanor, and she'd already published her first collection of poetry about growing up in a community that had been transformed from abandonment into opportunity. "Thank you for seeing us," Cassandra said, her voice carrying none of the seductive manipulation that had once been her trademark, but instead holding the humble gratitude of someone who understood that this meeting was a privilege rather than an entitlement. "Marcus and Jasmine wanted to meet you before the ceremony tonight." Eleanor had already crossed the room to greet the other teenagers, but Victoria watched with pride as her daughter engaged them with genuine interest rather than the condescending charity that wealthy people often showed those they considered beneath them. This was why Victoria had insisted Eleanor accompany her on every site visit, every community meeting, every moment where the real impact of their work was visible, because understanding that buildings housed human dreams was more important than any business degree. "Mrs. Whitmore," Marcus said, his voice strong but tinged with the nervousness of someone meeting a personal hero. "I wanted to thank you personally for everything you've done for our neighborhood. Ms. Reeves tells us stories about what it was like 15 years ago, but it's hard to imagine because all I've known is a community that works, where people have opportunities, where kids like me can dream about MIT instead of just surviving. Victoria's throat tightened with emotion, but she maintained her composure because showing strength meant acknowledging impact without making it about herself. The credit belongs to your community and to Ms. Reeves. I provided resources, but transformation required people who cared enough to do the hard work of rebuilding. You represent the success of that work, Marcus. Your MIT scholarship isn't charity. It's recognition that you've earned your place there through talent and dedication. Jasmine stepped forward with a book in her hands, but Victoria recognized it as the poetry collection that had won national awards and sparked conversations about economic inequality, urban revitalization, and the human cost of abandonment. I wanted you to have this. There's a poem on page 47 about Ms. Reeves, about watching her transform from someone the neighborhood didn't trust into someone we couldn't imagine being without. She talks about you sometimes, about how you gave her a choice when most people would have just wanted revenge. Victoria accepted the book with reverence, but she knew she'd read that poem later in private because the emotions it would evoke were too raw for public consumption. Thank you, Jasmine. Your words matter more than buildings or balance sheets because they tell the truth about what transformation really looks like. Eleanor and Jasmine had already retreated to the library to compare notes about their respective schools and aspirations, but Victoria noticed that Marcus lingered with a question he seemed afraid to ask. She waited patiently because rushing people through vulnerable moments was how opportunities for real connection got lost. "Can I ask you something personal?" Marcus finally said, glancing at Cassandra as if seeking permission. But the older woman nodded encouragingly. "Ms. Reeves told us what she did to you, how she was part of destroying your family, but you gave her a chance to become something better instead of just punishing her. I guess I want to know, how do you forgive something like that? How do you trust someone again after they've hurt you so badly?" The question hung in the air, but Victoria appreciated its depth because Marcus wasn't asking about business strategy or philanthropic philosophy. He was asking about the human capacity for grace in the face of betrayal, about whether redemption was real or just a pretty story people told themselves. Victoria gestured for them to sit, but she took time to formulate her answer because oversimplifying would diminish the complexity of what forgiveness actually required. Forgiveness isn't a single moment or a simple decision. It's a process that takes years and requires the person who hurt you to genuinely change, not just apologize or promise to be better, but actually do the difficult work of becoming someone different. Cassandra earned forgiveness through 15 years of consistent actions that proved she was committed to transformation. She looked at Cassandra directly, but saw the other woman's eyes glisten with tears, because even after 15 years, being forgiven still carried weight. But I also want to be honest with you, Marcus. There are parts of what happened that I'll never fully get over, moments where I still feel the pain of betrayal, even though I've moved past the anger. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or pretending the harm didn't happen. It means choosing not to let that harm define your future or the future of the person who hurt you. Cassandra spoke then, but her voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent 15 years thinking about these questions from the other side. What Victoria is too gracious to say is that forgiveness also requires the person being forgiven to accept that they can never fully repair what they broke. I can spend the rest of my life building communities and helping people, but I can never give Victoria back the 6 years I helped steal from her, can never undo the pain I caused. True redemption means living with that knowledge and choosing to be better anyway, not because it earns forgiveness, but because it's the right thing to do. The conversation was interrupted by Eleanor's return from the library, but she brought news that shifted the energy in the room from reflective to excited. "Mom, Jasmine just told me about the proposal for the Memphis property. She's been working with the Community Youth Council on a plan for a creative arts center that would serve 3 neighborhoods. The budget is incredibly detailed and the community support is overwhelming." Victoria raised an eyebrow at Cassandra, but the other woman's expression combined pride and nervousness because this was the first time she'd allowed her mentees to pitch a project directly to Victoria without her filtering or managing the presentation. "Jasmine has been working on this for 8 months. I've reviewed the numbers and the feasibility study, but I wanted her to present it to you herself because if we're going to build the next generation of Whitmore leaders, they need to learn how to advocate for their communities directly." The shift from redemption narrative to practical business felt abrupt, but Victoria understood that this was actually the culmination of everything they'd been building. Young people who'd grown up in revitalized communities, now proposing to pay that transformation forward to other neighborhoods that needed hope and investment. Jasmine returned with Eleanor, but she carried herself with a confidence that reminded Victoria of her younger self before Daniel's betrayal had temporarily broken her spirit. The girl opened her tablet and began presenting a proposal that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of community development, financial sustainability, and cultural programming. The Memphis-Soulsville neighborhood has a rich musical history, but decades of economic disinvestment have left it without spaces where young people can develop their talents, Jasmine explained, her voice steady despite the magnitude of pitching to someone worth over $150 billion. "Our proposal creates a creative arts center that serves 500 youth annually, but it's designed to be financially sustainable through a combination of grant funding, earned income from recording studio rentals, and partnerships with local colleges." Victoria listened intently, but she also watched Cassandra's face and saw the mentor's pride in her student's presentation, the way someone who'd once destroyed lives for personal gain had transformed into someone who elevated others. This was what redemption actually looked like, not dramatic gestures or tearful apologies, but consistent daily choices to build rather than destroy, to empower rather than exploit. The presentation concluded with financial projections that impressed even Victoria's experienced eye, but she knew that the numbers were only part of the equation. The real question was whether this project would genuinely serve the community, or whether it would become another well-intentioned failure that did more harm than good. "Jasmine, this is exceptional work," Victoria said carefully, "but I need you to answer a hard question. How do you prevent this arts center from becoming a catalyst for gentrification that displaces the very community you're trying to serve?" The question was a test, but Jasmine didn't flinch because she'd clearly anticipated this concern and had developed thoughtful answers. "We've built anti-displacement protections into every aspect of the project. The center will be governed by a community board with binding decision-making authority, not just advisory power. We've established income-restricted housing requirements for any future development within a half-mile radius, and we've structured the programming to prioritize existing residents rather than attracting outside artists who would drive up costs." Victoria glanced at Eleanor, but her daughter's expression indicated she'd already reviewed these details and found them sound, so Victoria made a decision that felt both monumental and entirely natural. "I'll fund the Memphis project on one condition. You and Eleanor co-manage the development as part of a youth leadership initiative. You'll work with Cassandra and our development team, but the primary decision-making authority rests with you two, because if the Whitmore legacy is going to continue, it needs to be in the hands of people who understand that buildings are about people first." The room erupted with excitement, but Victoria held up her hand because there was more that needed to be said. "This isn't charity or a gift. This is responsibility. You'll be accountable to the Memphis community, to our investors, and to the legacy my grandmother built. Failure isn't just disappointing. It's betraying people who desperately need this project to succeed. Are you ready for that pressure?" Both teenagers nodded with the kind of seriousness that indicated they understood the magnitude of what was being offered, but also the weight of what was being asked. Victoria had learned that true empowerment came not from protecting people from difficulty, but from giving them challenging opportunities and the support to meet those challenges. The afternoon continued with detailed discussions about timelines, budgets, and community engagement strategies. But eventually Cassandra needed to return to Detroit, and the teenagers had preparations for the evening ceremony. After they left, Victoria and Harrison stood alone in the penthouse office, reviewing documents. But the conversation quickly shifted to the other significant development that had been building for months. "Daniel's parole hearing is scheduled for next week," Harrison said carefully, watching Victoria's face for any sign of how she wanted to handle this news. "His attorney has been making noise about his exemplary behavior in prison and his sincere remorse for his actions. They're going to ask you to provide a statement supporting his early release." Victoria had known this moment was coming, but facing it still required her to dig deep into reserves of wisdom she'd spent 15 years cultivating. Daniel Hayes had served 15 years of his 25-year sentence, but unlike Cassandra, he'd spent that time maintaining his innocence, blaming Victoria for his imprisonment, and refusing every opportunity for genuine rehabilitation or personal growth. "What does Eleanor think?" Victoria asked, because her daughter's opinion mattered more than her own feelings when it came to decisions about the man who was biologically her father but had never chosen to be her parent. Harrison pulled out his tablet and showed Victoria a letter that Eleanor had written but hadn't yet shown her mother, requesting privacy to process her feelings before sharing them. The letter was thoughtful, nuanced, and heartbreaking in its maturity. "Dear Mom, I've thought a lot about the parole hearing and what I want to say about my biological father. I know you've protected me from the worst of his letters over the years, but I've read enough to understand that he hasn't changed. He's just learned to say the right things to manipulate parole boards. Part of me wants to believe that everyone deserves a second chance, that redemption is always possible if someone genuinely wants it. You taught me that through your relationship with Cassandra, through the work we do in our communities, but you also taught me that redemption requires genuine change, not just performance or manipulation. From everything I've learned about Daniel Hayes, he's never chosen to do the hard work of becoming better. He's never acknowledged the real harm he caused, not just to you, but to his fraud victims, to the communities he damaged, to me by refusing to be a father. He's spent 15 years in prison blaming everyone else for consequences he earned through his own choices. I don't want him released early, not because I'm angry or because I want revenge, but because releasing him would be unjust to his victims and would reward behavior that doesn't deserve reward. If he serves his full sentence and emerges genuinely committed to making amends, then maybe I'll consider meeting him someday. But that decision will be mine to make as an adult, not something I'm pressured into because the system values his freedom over his victim's justice. I hope this doesn't disappoint you. I know you've always believed in giving people chances to change. But I think there's a difference between offering opportunities for redemption and excusing people from facing the full consequences of their actions. Love, Eleanor. Victoria read the letter twice, but by the end, tears were streaming down her face because her daughter had captured exactly the wisdom Victoria had spent 15 years trying to cultivate, the balance between compassion and accountability, between believing in redemption and refusing to enable those who wouldn't do the work to earn it. "She's remarkable," Harrison said softly, his own voice thick with emotion because he'd watched Eleanor grow from an infant into this wise, thoughtful young woman. Marguerite would be so proud of both of you. I'll submit a statement opposing early parole, Victoria decided, her voice steady despite the tears, because this was one of those moments where strength meant making difficult decisions rather than easy ones. Not because I'm still angry at Daniel. I stopped being angry years ago, but because justice demands that he serve the sentence he earned. His victims deserve that much, and Eleanor deserves to grow up knowing that consequences are real and that manipulation doesn't triumph over truth. The evening ceremony was held in the Detroit Community Center that had been one of the first buildings renovated 15 years ago, but the space was packed with residents, local officials, and representatives from the other 6 communities that had been transformed through similar projects. The occasion was the 15th anniversary of the Whitmore Revitalization Initiative, but it was also a celebration of Cassandra Reeves's official promotion to Vice President of Community Development, a role that recognized her 15 years of exceptional work and granted her authority over all 7 revitalization projects. Victoria stood at the podium looking out at the crowd, but what struck her was the diversity of faces, the intergenerational presence of families who'd lived through the neighborhood's darkest days and were now thriving in its renaissance. She saw small business owners whose shops she'd personally helped finance, teachers working in schools the Whitmore Foundation had rebuilt, children who'd grown up in safe, stable housing that hadn't existed before her grandmother's vision had been brought to life. 15 years ago, I stood in the rain having lost everything I thought defined me, Victoria began, her voice carrying across the room with the practiced ease of someone who'd given hundreds of speeches, but never lost the authenticity that made people lean in and listen. A marriage, a home, a sense of security, all gone in a single day. But that same day, I inherited something far more valuable, a legacy of transformation, a commitment to building rather than destroying, and a challenge to use power not to crush enemies, but to create opportunities for redemption. She gestured to Cassandra, but the other woman's face reflected 15 years of complex emotions, gratitude, remorse, pride, and the kind of hard-won peace that came from genuine transformation. Cassandra Reeves helped destroy my life. 15 years ago, she could have spent 25 years in prison, but instead, she chose to spend those years rebuilding not just this community, but herself. Some people think forgiveness is weakness, that giving second chances rewards bad behavior. But I believe, and my grandmother believed, that the truest measure of strength is whether you can look someone who hurt you in the eye and say, I see who you were. I acknowledge the harm you caused, but I'm willing to bet on who you can become. The crowd erupted in applause, but Victoria noticed that several people were crying, moved by the raw honesty of what she was describing. This wasn't a sanitized redemption story where everything was neat and simple. This was messy, complicated, real transformation that had required years of hard work, difficult conversations, and the willingness to remain vulnerable while maintaining boundaries. Cassandra took the podium next, but her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the microphone, betraying the nerves that still surfaced when she had to speak about her past. 15 years ago, I was the worst version of myself, cruel, selfish, destructive, and proud of it. I hurt Victoria in ways I can never fully repair, damaged countless others through fraud and manipulation, and genuinely believed that wealth and status were the only things that mattered in life. She paused, gathering herself, but when she continued, her voice was stronger. Victoria could have destroyed me. She had every right to, had all the power to do it, and I certainly deserved it. Instead, she offered me something I'd never experienced, the opportunity to become someone better, not through words or promises, but through actions and daily choices, to serve rather than exploit. These 15 years haven't been easy. Living in modest circumstances while managing community development has been humbling in ways I needed but didn't always appreciate. Facing people I'd harmed, earning trust I'd destroyed, building something meaningful from the wreckage of who I used to be. All of it required letting go of pride and ego and learning what actually matters in life. Cassandra's eyes found Victoria's in the crowd, but the look they shared held 15 years of complicated history, pain that had been acknowledged if not entirely healed, and mutual respect that had been earned rather than given. I'll never be able to give Victoria back what I took from her. I can't return those 6 years of marriage I helped destroy, can't undo the pain I caused, can't erase the betrayal. But I can spend the rest of my life building communities, creating opportunities, and passing on the second chance I was given to others who deserve redemption. That's not payment, it's purpose, and it's the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. The ceremony continued with testimonials from community members whose lives had been transformed by the revitalization projects. But Victoria found herself reflecting on the question Marcus had asked earlier. How do you forgive something like that? The answer, she realized, wasn't simple or universal. It was personal, contextual, and required both parties to do difficult work over extended periods of time. Later that night, back in the Manhattan penthouse, with Eleanor curled up beside her on the couch, reviewing the Memphis project plans, Victoria felt a profound sense of peace that had nothing to do with wealth or status or revenge, but everything to do with purpose and legacy and the knowledge that she'd built something worth passing down to the next generation. "Mom," Eleanor said, looking up from her tablet with the expression she wore when asking questions that mattered. "Do you ever regret giving Cassandra a second chance instead of just sending her to prison?" Victoria considered the question carefully, but she knew that honesty served her daughter better than platitudes. "Sometimes, there are moments when I remember the cruelty of what she did. When I see that photo she sent me of her and your father in my former bedroom, and I feel angry that she got to build a meaningful life instead of rotting in prison. But those moments pass, and what remains is pride in what we've built together. Not friendship exactly, but something more valuable. A partnership based on mutual respect, accountability, and shared commitment to transformation." Eleanor absorbed this, but then asked the question Victoria had been dreading. "What about my father? Do you ever regret not giving him the same chance?" "No," Victoria answered without hesitation, "because redemption requires choosing it. And your father has spent 15 years choosing pride over growth, blame over accountability, manipulation over honesty. I offered him the same opportunity I gave Cassandra, the chance to transform his mistakes into meaning. But he refused because accepting it would have required admitting he was wrong. That was his choice, not mine. Some people aren't ready for redemption, and trying to force it on them just enables their refusal to change." The conversation drifted to other topics, but Victoria knew this wouldn't be the last time they discussed Daniel Hayes, because Eleanor was approaching the age where she'd need to make her own decisions about whether to pursue any relationship with her biological father. Victoria's job wasn't to make those decisions for her daughter, but to provide the wisdom and support necessary for Eleanor to make informed choices that honored both her compassion and her boundaries. 3 months later, Daniel Hayes's parole request was denied based on Victoria's statement, Eleanor's letter, and testimony from several fraud victims who'd never recovered financially from his schemes. The decision sparked some controversy in the media. A few commentators argued that Victoria was using her wealth and influence to keep Daniel imprisoned out of spite. But Victoria refused to engage with these narratives because she knew the truth, and the truth was that justice sometimes required people to face the full consequences of their actions, regardless of how sincerely they apologized. Daniel's response to the denial came in the form of a letter that Harrison intercepted before it reached Eleanor, but he showed it to Victoria because she needed to know what they were dealing with. The letter was filled with rage, accusations, and threats, that demonstrated Daniel still hadn't learned the fundamental lesson that his imprisonment should have taught him, that actions have consequences, and blaming others for those consequences was just another form of the entitlement that had led to his crimes in the first place. "He'll serve his full sentence," Harrison confirmed, shredding the letter because Eleanor didn't need to see her father's vitriol. "And when he's released in 10 years, we'll ensure appropriate restraining orders are in place to protect both you and Eleanor from any attempts at harassment or manipulation." Victoria nodded, but she felt more sadness than anger because Daniel represented the tragic alternative to Cassandra's redemption story, someone who'd been given every opportunity to change but had chosen to remain trapped in his own bitterness and pride. "Make sure the fraud victims know that we supported the parole denial. They deserve to know that his freedom wasn't prioritized over their justice." The years continued to unfold, with the kind of purposeful momentum that came from building something meaningful rather than just accumulating wealth. The Memphis Arts Center opened to overwhelming community support, but Eleanor and Jasmine's co-management proved so successful that it became a model for other youth-led development projects across the Whitmore portfolio. Marcus completed his MIT degree and returned to Detroit to launch a tech startup focused on creating economic opportunities in revitalized urban neighborhoods. But he did it from office space in the community center, where Cassandra had first managed to prove that redemption was possible. Victoria's empire grew to $200 billion by her 50th birthday, but she measured success not by the size of her portfolio but by the number of communities transformed, families housed, opportunities created, and lives changed through the principles her grandmother had established and she'd refined through 15 years of leadership. Cassandra became more than just an employee or a reformed enemy. She became a trusted advisor, a complicated friend, and eventually someone Victoria could genuinely say she'd forgiven, though that forgiveness was always tempered by the memory of harm caused and the knowledge that some wounds leave permanent scars even after they heal. The most unexpected development came on Eleanor's 18th birthday, when a letter arrived from Daniel Hayes that was different from all the others. This letter didn't demand anything, didn't blame anyone, didn't manipulate or threaten. Instead, it was a simple acknowledgement. "Eleanor, happy 18th birthday. I don't deserve to be part of your life, and I'm not writing to ask for that privilege. I'm writing to tell you that I've finally started to understand what your mother tried to teach me 15 years ago, that redemption requires genuine change, not just words or performance. I've spent the past 3 years in prison education programs, not because I thought it would impress parole boards, but because I finally got tired of being the person who destroyed everything good in his life. I've facilitated financial literacy classes for other inmates, helped dozens of men prepare for life after release, and spent thousands of hours in therapy actually confronting what I did and why I did it. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking to meet you or be part of your life. I'm simply telling you that I'm trying, finally, belatedly, inadequately, to become someone who might someday deserve the chance to apologize properly for all the ways I failed you, your mother, and everyone else I hurt. You don't owe me anything. Your mother doesn't owe me anything, but I wanted you to know on your 18th birthday that the man who kicked your pregnant mother out into the rain died somewhere in the past few years, and whoever I'm becoming now will spend the rest of his life trying to make amends for that man's actions, even if those amends can never be enough." Daniel, Eleanor read the letter 3 times, but then she brought it to Victoria with tears in her eyes and a question that had no easy answer. "What do I do with this?" Victoria held her daughter close, but she knew that her job wasn't to tell Eleanor what to think or feel, but to help her develop the wisdom to make her own choices. "That's entirely up to you, sweetheart. This letter might represent genuine change, or it might be another manipulation. Only time will tell. But you're 18 now, an adult capable of making your own decisions about whether to respond, whether to open communication, whether to eventually meet him after his release. Whatever you choose, I'll support you. What would you do? Eleanor asked, seeking guidance without demanding it be prescribed. Victoria thought carefully, but then shared the wisdom 15 years had taught her. I'd be cautiously hopeful, but protect myself with boundaries. I'd acknowledge the letter, maybe even respond briefly, but I wouldn't rush into anything or make promises I wasn't ready to keep. And I'd remember that words are easy, but consistent actions over years are what prove whether change is real. Eleanor nodded slowly, but Victoria could see her daughter processing this new development with the same thoughtful wisdom she applied to community development projects and business decisions. I think I want to write back, not to promise anything, but to acknowledge that I see he's trying, and that if he continues to do the work of becoming better, maybe someday, maybe I'll consider meeting him. But that's years away and entirely dependent on whether his actions match his words. That sounds like wisdom, Victoria confirmed, proud of her daughter's ability to balance compassion with self-protection, hope with caution, openness with boundaries. The letter Eleanor eventually sent was brief but fair, acknowledging Daniel's apparent growth while making clear that any relationship would need to be earned through years of consistent behavior rather than granted based on a single letter. It was the kind of response that left the door open without walking through it. Exactly the balance that difficult situations required. 5 years later, Victoria stood in the same Detroit community center where she'd celebrated the 15th anniversary of the Whitmore Revitalization Initiative. But this time the occasion was Eleanor's wedding to a community organizer she'd met while co-managing the Memphis Arts Center. The ceremony was simple but profound, officiated by Cassandra Reeves, who'd become ordained specifically for this occasion, and attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the Whitmore legacy. Daniel Hayes had been released from prison 6 months earlier, but Eleanor had made the difficult decision not to invite him to her wedding because reconciliation was still in its earliest stages and her wedding day wasn't the appropriate venue for navigating that complicated relationship. Victoria supported this decision absolutely because protecting Eleanor's boundaries was more important than any symbolic gesture of family unity. What struck Victoria most about the ceremony wasn't the luxury or the guest list, but the intergenerational presence of people who represented different chapters of the transformation story. Marcus was there with his wife and newborn son, talking excitedly about expanding his tech startup to 3 more cities. Jasmine stood as one of Eleanor's bridesmaids, having just published her 2nd poetry collection to critical acclaim. Community members from all 7 revitalization projects had traveled to Detroit to celebrate the wedding of the woman who'd helped transform their neighborhoods while still a teenager. And Cassandra stood at the altar with tears streaming down her face as she pronounced Eleanor and her new spouse married. But Victoria knew those tears were about more than just the ceremony. They were about the impossible journey from being the mistress who destroyed a family to being the one entrusted with officiating the wedding of the daughter from that destroyed family, all because redemption had been chosen and earned through 20 years of consistent, difficult, transformative work. At the reception, Victoria found herself standing at the edge of the celebration, watching Eleanor dance with her new spouse, but her mind traveled back 20 years to that rain-soaked afternoon when everything had fallen apart. If someone had told her then that she'd end up here, wealthy beyond measure, running a $200 billion empire, watching her daughter marry in a community center that represented transformation rather than destruction, with her former enemy officiating the ceremony as a trusted friend, she would never have believed it possible. But this was the power of choosing grace over vengeance, transformation over destruction, long-term purpose over short-term satisfaction. This was what her grandmother had known and tried to teach her through the inheritance. That true strength wasn't about crushing enemies, but about building something so meaningful that old wounds became footnotes in a much larger story about resilience, redemption, and the human capacity for change. Harrison appeared beside her with champagne, but his smile was tinged with the bittersweet emotion of someone who'd watched this entire journey unfold from the beginning. Marguerite would be so proud of everything you've built, not just the empire, but the legacy of transformation that defines it. I wish she could be here to see this, Victoria admitted, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability because Harrison was one of the few people who'd earned that privilege. I wish I'd known her, learned from her directly, heard her stories, and understood her vision before having to figure it all out myself. But that was exactly her point, Harrison said gently, his eyes reflecting decades of wisdom and understanding. She knew that true leadership couldn't be taught. It had to be forged through adversity, through difficult choices, through the experience of losing everything and building it back better than before. She gave you the tools, but you did the work of becoming someone worthy of the legacy. The evening continued with dancing, toasts, and the kind of celebration that marked not just a wedding, but the culmination of 2 decades of transformation. But Victoria found herself periodically stepping outside to stand in the Detroit evening air and marvel at the impossible journey that had brought her to this moment. A figure approached from the shadows, but Victoria tensed instinctively until she recognized one of the security team members who'd been protecting her since she'd first inherited the empire. "Ma'am, there's someone here asking to see you. We've verified he's not a threat, but given his identity, we wanted to check with you before allowing him to approach." Victoria's heart sank because she already knew who it must be, but she took a deep breath and made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. "It's Daniel, isn't it?" The security guard nodded, but his expression remained professionally neutral because this was Victoria's decision to make without judgment or pressure. "He says he won't approach unless you give permission. He's waiting at the edge of the property with a wedding gift and a letter for Eleanor. He specifically requested that we tell you he doesn't expect to be invited in or to see either of you. He just wanted to deliver the gift and pay his respects from a distance." Victoria considered her options, but then made the choice that felt aligned with the values she'd spent 20 years cultivating. "I'll meet him at the property edge, alone but with security within sight. If he's truly changed, then he'll respect boundaries. If he hasn't, then we'll know that too." The walk to the property edge felt longer than it was, but Victoria used the time to center herself and remember that she was no longer the broken, abandoned woman Daniel had kicked out 20 years ago. She was Victoria Whitmore, heir to a $200 billion empire, mother to an exceptional daughter, and someone who'd built a legacy that would outlast any individual relationship. Daniel Hayes stood at the property line holding a small wrapped package, but the man Victoria saw bore only superficial resemblance to the arrogant, cruel husband who'd destroyed their marriage. At 53, he looked older than his years, but there was something different in his eyes. Humility, perhaps, or genuine remorse, though Victoria knew that discerning real change from performance required time and consistency, rather than a single encounter. "Thank you for seeing me," Daniel said quietly, keeping his distance and his hands visible in a gesture that suggested he understood the power dynamic had permanently shifted. "I know I have no right to be here, and I promise I'm not trying to insert myself into Eleanor's wedding. I just wanted to deliver this gift and tell you something I should have said 20 years ago." Victoria remained silent, but her posture was guarded because trust was earned through actions over years, not granted based on a single conversation. Daniel seemed to understand this because he didn't try to approach or touch her, didn't attempt to manipulate or charm, just stood his ground and spoke his truth. I'm sorry. Not the performative sorry of someone trying to get something, but the genuine sorry of someone who's finally understood the magnitude of harm I caused. I destroyed our marriage, abandoned you while pregnant, committed crimes that ruined dozens of lives, and spent 15 years in prison blaming everyone but myself for consequences I earned through my own choices. I was a monster, Victoria, not because I was born that way, but because I chose pride, greed, and cruelty over growth, honesty, and compassion. He held out the package but made no move to close the distance between them. This is for Eleanor. It's a photo album I put together of her childhood, pictures your mother sent to prison over the years, along with letters I wrote to her, but never sent because I wasn't ready to be the father she deserved. I'm still not sure I'll ever be that person, but I wanted her to know that even when I was at my worst, some part of me understood what I was missing, what I'd thrown away by choosing ego over family. Victoria accepted the package, but her voice was firm when she spoke, because compassion didn't require abandoning boundaries. Eleanor will decide if and when she's ready to have a relationship with you. That timeline is entirely hers to set, and any pressure or manipulation to speed it up will end whatever chance you might have. Do you understand? Completely, Daniel confirmed, without defensiveness or argument. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect a relationship. I don't even expect to be part of her life in any meaningful way. I just wanted to acknowledge the milestone and pay my respects to the daughter I failed and the woman I betrayed. They stood in silence for a moment, but Victoria found herself asking the question that had haunted her for 20 years. Why? Why did you do it? Was our entire marriage a lie, or did you actually love me at some point? Daniel's face contorted with emotion that appeared genuine, but Victoria maintained her skepticism because manipulators were skilled at performing remorse. I loved you in the limited way I was capable of loving anyone at that time, which was conditional, selfish, and ultimately inadequate. I loved the version of you that served my needs and made me look good, but I didn't love the real you because I never took the time to truly see you. When you got pregnant and I realized that meant accountability and sacrifice and putting someone else's needs first, I panicked and chose the easier path of running away with Cassandra rather than doing the hard work of becoming a better person. The honesty was brutal, but Victoria appreciated it more than false platitudes because truth, even painful truth, was the foundation of any genuine change. Cassandra became a better person. She did the work. Why did it take you so much longer? Pride, Daniel admitted simply. Cassandra was humbled from the beginning because she knew she'd lost everything and had to earn her way back. I still had my arrogance, my belief that I was the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of my own destruction. It took 15 years in prison, losing every appeal, watching Cassandra transform while I stagnated before I finally broke down enough to actually confront who I'd become and why. Victoria nodded slowly, but she knew that this conversation needed to end before it became something more complicated than either of them was ready for. I hope you continue to do the work of becoming better, not for me, not even for Eleanor, but for yourself and for the people you harmed. Real redemption is a lifelong process, not a destination you reach and then stop working toward. I know, Daniel said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he'd learned this lesson the hard way through years of false starts and backsliding. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for building something beautiful from the wreckage I created. And thank you for protecting Eleanor from my worst instincts for 20 years, while still leaving the door open for me to maybe, someday, earn a place in her life. Victoria turned to leave, but then she stopped and shared one final piece of wisdom, because even though Daniel had destroyed her life 20 years ago, she was no longer the woman he'd destroyed, and he was apparently no longer the man who'd done the destroying. The difference between you and Cassandra isn't capacity for change, it's timing. She chose redemption when offered it. You chose pride. But the fact that you eventually made the choice matters, even if it took longer than it should have. Don't waste the years you have left making the same mistakes. Walking back to the celebration, Victoria felt lighter than she had in years, because that encounter had provided closure on a wound that had never quite healed, despite 20 years of building something new. Daniel's apology didn't erase the harm he'd caused, didn't restore the 6 years he'd stolen, didn't undo the abandonment, but it did confirm what Victoria had always believed, that people were capable of change if they genuinely wanted it and were willing to do the difficult work required. Inside the community center, Eleanor was laughing with Cassandra and Jasmine, but when she saw her mother return, her eyes held a question that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Victoria simply handed her the package and whispered, "From your father, open it when you're ready. No pressure, no expectations, just his attempt to acknowledge your milestone." Eleanor nodded and tucked the package away, but Victoria knew her daughter would process this development in her own time, making her own decisions about whether to pursue any relationship with Daniel, based on her own wisdom and boundaries rather than anyone else's expectations. The celebration continued into the early morning hours, but as Victoria stood surrounded by people whose lives had been transformed through the legacy her grandmother had built and she'd refined, she finally understood the full scope of what Marguerite had been trying to teach her through that inheritance letter 20 years ago. Whitmore women are forged in fire. You've survived the flames. Now build your empire. The fire had been Daniel's betrayal, Cassandra's cruelty, the abandonment and the pain, and the moment when everything fell apart. But surviving those flames had taught her that true strength wasn't about never being broken. It was about rebuilding yourself into something stronger, wiser, and more purposeful than you'd been before the breaking. The empire she'd built wasn't just $200 billion in assets and properties across 17 states. It was communities transformed, lives changed, second chances offered and earned. The next generation of leaders like Eleanor and Jasmine and Marcus, who'd been given opportunities to build something meaningful, rather than just accumulate wealth. And perhaps most importantly, it was the knowledge that grace was stronger than vengeance, that transformation was more powerful than destruction, and that the truest measure of character wasn't how you treated people who served you, but how you treated people who'd wronged you when you had the power to destroy them. 20 years after standing in the rain with nothing but a suitcase and an unopened letter, Victoria Whitmore had built an empire that would last for generations. But more than that, she'd built a legacy that proved her grandmother's core belief, that Whitmore women weren't just forged in fire. They used that fire to illuminate the path toward redemption, transformation, and the revolutionary idea that power was most meaningful when used to lift others up rather than tear them down. As the first light of dawn broke over Detroit, Victoria stood at the community center windows, watching the city wake up, a city that had itself been forged in fire, abandoned and forgotten, but was now rising again through the same principles that had guided her own transformation. And she knew with absolute certainty that this was what it meant to truly inherit not just wealth, but wisdom, to take the broken pieces of what was and build something beautiful from the ruins, to offer redemption while demanding accountability, to remember the pain while refusing to be defined by it, and to create a future so purposeful that the betrayals of the past became nothing more than the foundation upon which something magnificent was built. The pregnant, abandoned wife had become the architect of transformation. The $100 billion inheritance had become a tool for building communities rather than just accumulating wealth. And the woman who'd been kicked out in the rain had learned to dance in the storms, knowing that Whitmore women didn't just survive the flames. They emerged from them with the power to light the way for others who were still learning to rise from their own ashes.